Hi everybody. So the purpose of this short video is just to walk you through the rest of the lecture material that we weren't able to cover in Monday's class so that you can have some guidance from me about the rest of what's going on in Heidegger while I'm away for work. So if you'll remember, the end of class on Monday, we got up to this point where we were thinking about Dasein having an essence that is defined by its existence. And that because it's defined by its existence, in terms of its own activities, Dasein is self-related. It is related to itself. It is self-aware through a kind of concern. We're concerned about ourselves because we can choose what to do with our lives. So it's worth asking, and now I'm going explicitly from the bottom half of the fourth page of your handout. Why Dasein? Why thematize and theorize about the human being through the lens of this German colloquialism of Dasein? The answer is something like the following. First, Heidegger wants us to understand that human beings exist in situations, that we don't have an abstract essence that can be understood from outside of how we ordinarily act in what he'll call our average everydayness. Because of this, our existence is the canvas on which we paint our own essence. We create our essence by choosing to take up with the world in different ways. We are always being there, Dasein, in some concrete factual way. And the fact of our existence, that is our essence. So I'm now going to walk you through the third section of the handout where we start to think more carefully about Heidegger's precise views about death, which he calls being towards death. So the first idea that we have to understand is this idea of wholeness. And so I'm going to read to you now a passage from Being in Time that's quoted on the bottom of page 4 of your handout and spills over onto the top of page 5 of your handout. So I'm just going to get my water bottle. I'm back. Here's what Heidegger has to say about wholeness. As a being who is entangled with its world by projecting possibilities, there is a question of how much of itself Dasein can know. So Heidegger here is saying that because we are always tangled up with the world and projecting possibilities into the future through our actions in the present, we are always sort of ahead of ourselves. We don't fully know ourselves. In Heidegger's terms, there's a question of whether Dasein can ever know itself holistically, as a whole. So turn now to the top of page 5 of your handout. Heidegger thinks that it is necessary that we obtain a knowledge of Dasein as a holistic phenomenon. And here's the quote. With regard to the forehaving of the whole of Dasein, which must necessarily be obtained, we must ask whether this being, Dasein, as something existing, can become accessible at all in its being as a whole. So he thinks we strive to know ourselves fully, but often fail to know ourselves fully. We have a sense, this is what he calls forehaving, before, right? A kind of self-possession that isn't fully articulated. And we want to obtain it. We have to obtain it. But there's a question of how we go about doing that. So how? How do we come to understand ourselves holistically? To understand Dasein as a whole, we must understand the basic constitution of Dasein. We have to understand what is Dasein, human being, like in its most basic. For Heidegger, this is what he calls Sorge, care. Care. The primary factor of care being ahead of itself, however, means that Dasein always exists for the sake of itself. This returns to that idea we talked about in the previous class about Dasein being concerned for its own being. So here's how I would cash out that quote. In being oriented, directed towards, caught up with, enmeshed with a world, we take care of things in it. Like these kinds of things. We surround ourselves with things that we care about and people that we care about. And that's the context for how we live. And when we act, when we do these interactions, when we take care of ourselves and others and our things, we always do so with a certain kind of purpose in mind. We're goal-oriented. We're always doing it for a certain end. And we might not know what that end is. We often act as if we're on autopilot. No one's denying that. But we are purposeful beings. We act with purpose. And Heidegger calls this the for the sake of which. We're always doing things for the sake of something else, which means we're always future-oriented, right? We're always acting in a way that anticipates a future, which will hopefully actualize our goals that we hold in the present and which animate our actions. So we are futorial. We are future-oriented in the way that we take care. Our projects are oriented towards what is to come. And we're also for having, in the sense that we have knowledge of our capacity to project possibilities. What does it mean to project a possibility? It means that you are able to understand that from where you are now, there are many branches forward in your life. And you get to choose which one to go down. And that knowledge exists in you, and the way you interrelate to that knowledge and your action structures the essence of your life through your choices. That's what happens when you act. So you make a choice about what's important. You make a choice about what's not important. You bring some future into being, and you exclude some other potential future from being. And you are doing this all the time. Okay? So because of this orientation towards the future, we're always kind of incomplete. Heidegger says, and this is the middle of the 5th page of your handout, Heidegger says, this structural factor of care tells us unambiguously that something is always still outstanding in Dasein, which has not yet become real as a potentiality of its being. A constant unfinished quality thus lies in the essence of the basic constitution of Dasein. This unfinished quality only becomes complete when we die. Because up until the moment of death, we're always projecting possibilities into the future, which means there is always some incompleteness in us in virtue of our futural orientation. Once our being in the world ceases at the moment of death, and all possibilities become impossible for us because we're dead, that is when Dasein reaches its wholeness in death. It simultaneously loses the being of being there, because it's no longer there, because it has died. So death is not something not yet objectively present, nor the last outstanding element reduced to a minimum, but rather an immanence. This is really important. Page 5, the quote from 240. I'm going to read it one more time. Death is not something not yet objectively present, nor the last outstanding element reduced to a minimum, but rather an immanence. So he's rejecting two possible ways of thinking about death and embracing one. Let's understand the two possibilities that he's rejecting, and then think more carefully about the one that he's embracing and what it means. Okay. Death is not something that is not yet objectively present. What does that mean? It means that death isn't a thing. It isn't a thing that you'll eventually see. It's not just an object that isn't present yet, but will one day be present. It is not just an inevitability. nor is it an abstract object that you will one day grasp. Nor is it the last outstanding element reduced to a minimum. Death is not just one thing that comes after a bunch of other things, but it's just the minimum of those things because it's the end of you. It's not just another bead on a pearl necklace of your life. Rather, it is an imminence. Imminent here means that it is in a state of being just about to happen. Death is always just about to happen. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to die for sure in the next minute, but it means as a possibility for your life, it's always imminent. There's never a moment in your life where the next moment might not be your death. And that is a structural point about how your mind and your life fill time with meaning. That at any given moment, your death is imminent. It is also eminent and imminent. Eminence, the second, this is the bottom of page 5 of your handout, is a presence or a positive quality of importance. The importance of death is, you can't overstate it. It's essential. And imminence means existing or operating from within. So I'm going to read a passage that I wrote for you on the bottom of page 5. It goes like this. Death is imminent because it is always just around the corner. It is eminent because it plays a special role in defining the horizon of our possibilities. And it is immanent because it structures our perspective either tacitly or actively, authentically or inauthentically, in light of our foreknowledge of its certainty. I'm going to read that one more time. Death is imminent because it is always just around the corner. It is eminent because it plays a special role in defining the horizon of our possibilities. It is imminent because it structures our perspective, either tacitly, subtly, beneath the surface of our ordinary habits of attention, or actively, explicitly, in a thematic way. It structures our perspective either authentically or inauthentically, in light of how we relate to our foreknowledge of its absolute certainty. How do you, on an average everyday level, relate to your own foreknowledge of the inevitability of and certainty of your death? That's Heidegger's question. What is the shape of your life? What are the nature of your choices? And what is the relationship that you have to your own knowledge of your own death? And how does that knowledge condition your life? Heidegger is a bit of a philosophical pessimist about this, because he thinks that human beings have a very powerful tendency to ignore this kind of knowledge, to repress it, to flee from it, to try to get away from it, which is understandable. It's not the greatest fact you've ever known. But its centrality to the possibility of living a meaningful life could not be overstated. So what Heidegger is going to do now is he's going to talk about the public dimensions of our collective behavior around death. And he's going to criticize it a little bit. So on the top of page 6 of your handout, I include a quote from Being in Time here. And he says, "The publicness of everyday being with one another knows death as a constantly occurring event, as a case of death. Someone or another dies, be it a neighbor or a stranger. People unknown to us die daily and hourly. Death is encountered as a familiar event occurring within the world. The fleeting talk about this, which is either expressed or else mostly kept back, says, one also dies at the end, but for now, one is not affected." What Heidegger's talking about here is the fact that death is something that we encounter a lot. You turn on the news and you'll hear all kinds of things about death. But Heidegger's point here is that this pervasiveness of death is taken up publicly, intersubjectively, in a way that's inauthentic, that is not appropriately sensitive to Dasein's own most understanding and possibility for being in the world. What does that mean? Well, it means that we have a kind of abstract relationship to death. That death is a kind of thing that happens. It's just an event that this person died or that person died. And after all, one day I have to die, but right now not. And Heidegger's point is like, this is a very abstract understanding of death that kind of erases and obscures the fundamental structural influence and conditioning that death has on our moment-to-moment experience of the meaningful world. So this passage I just read to you is one that claims that death is something that happens all the time, but for us is something that will eventually happen in the future. And this deferral to the future, this idea that death is just another event that happens sometime in the future, that's what Heidegger is trying to attack. That's what he's trying to argue against. And so he says, this public interpretation of death says that one dies because in this way everyone can convince him or herself that in no case is it I myself, for this one is no one. Dying is leveled down to an event which does not concern Dasein, but which belongs to no one in particular. This is we're now drilling down into Heidegger's deeper point, where death is something that it is very easy for us to disavow our ownership of it. He says here, death belongs to no one in particular, and yet it belongs to each and every one of us. We must each face our own death. No one else can do that for us. And because of that, he thinks death individuates Dasein. What does that mean? Death individuates Dasein because the personal burden of death makes us uniquely and powerfully self-aware. And that we must learn to take control of that self-awareness so that we act in a world in full understanding of our possibilities. And we must stop doing what we always do, which is we push away the personal burden of death by thinking about it as an impersonal eventuality. Let me say that one more time. We habitually and collectively push away the personal existential burden of death by thinking about it as an impersonal eventuality rather than something that is imminent in every moment of life. Heidegger is going to conclude his discussion with two ways that we flee from death. And I'm going to read two passages on this, and then I'll break them down for you. And we're now at the very end of the 6th page of your handout. So, feigning certainty. Here's Heidegger. He says, the entangled everydayness of Dasein knows about the certainty of death, and yet avoids being certain. But in the light of what it evades, this evasion itself bears witness phenomenally to the fact that death must be grasped as the own most non-relational, insuperable, certain possibility. This first sentence is amazing. He says, in our everyday wrapped up life of moment to moment, just getting through the day, the entangled everydayness of Dasein, that kind of human being knows about the certainty of death and yet avoids being certain. How many times have you been to a funeral and someone has said to you, I can't believe they're gone. I can't believe it. Why not? Why can't you believe it? It's highly likely that this person is dead. Why? Because everyone's going to die. We live our lives in a way where we are abstractly aware of the certainty of death as a possibility that will eventually come. But even though we have that abstract certainty, our average, everyday, distracted way of life prevents us from actually living in the certainty of death. We avoid being certain. And so, in the light of what it evades, this evasion of being certainty, this pushing away of the certainty in our everyday living, that evasion itself bears witness in our experience to the fact that death must be grasped as our own most non-relational, insuperable certain possibility. What does that mean? Own most means possessed by me fundamentally. Non-relational means that no matter what happens, this possibility is imminent for me. Insuperable, cannot be overcome, cannot be swept aside, will not be dismissed. Certain possibility, absolutely certain. We push that away and in order to avoid living with that certainty. And in doing that, in repressing it, in ignoring it, in getting rid of it, we further understand in a way that we like to ignore this fundamental truth about death. That it is our own most non-relational, insuperable, certain possibility in life. Very powerful. How do we do that? Well, one of the most important ways for Heidegger is that we get absorbed into what he calls the they self. We just do whatever they're doing. We just go along with what they're doing. We allow ourselves to slip into a semi-conscious herd mentality that gets us through our day. Here's Heidegger. The they, covers over what is peculiar to the certainty of death, that it is possible in every moment. Together with the certainty of death goes the indefiniteness of its when. We don't know when it will come. Every day, being towards death evades this indefiniteness by making it something definite. But this procedure cannot mean calculating when the demise is due to arrive. We can't do that. Dasein rather flees from such definiteness. Every day taking care of things makes definite for itself the indefiniteness of the certain death by interposing before it those manageable urgencies and possibilities of the everyday matters nearest to us. That last sentence is the key. Our everyday taking care of things, our obsession with the everyday minutiae of life, makes definite for itself the indefiniteness of death. We get wrapped up in the details of our life, which solidifies the indefiniteness of death, which allows us to ignore it. And this procedure cannot mean calculating the demise. It doesn't give us that kind of knowledge. Rather, we flee from such definiteness. We flee from it. And we replace that certainty of death. We interpose for it manageable urgencies, all the things we get angry and upset about. Put it in the form of a question. How many things that get you riled up on a weekly basis would really get you riled up if your mind was firmly anchored on the inevitability of your own death? Wouldn't some of these average everyday entanglements start to relax and dissipate? Would you become perhaps less invested, less obsessed? I think the answer is something like yes, obviously. So this is just to scratch the surface of what Heidegger's thought has to offer us. And between now and next week, The question you should be asking yourself is, if death is this imminent, almost insuperable possibility for us, and the essence of our lives is shaped by us in our actions, then what is the meaning of our lives? What's its value? What's its purpose? Does it have any of those things? And how are we to shape our lives in a meaningful, purposeful, valuable way, given the ubiquity and depth of our suffering? So next week, we're going to think about how to answer that question by reading some stuff from Buddhist philosophy and a wonderful passage from the end of an important book by a philosopher who died recently, Derek Parfit, who wrote an important book in the early 80s called Reasons and Persons. And we're going to read a section of that book called What Makes One's Life Go Best. So, read those texts carefully before next Monday, and I hope you enjoy the holiday, and I will see you when I get back. Bye.